Hello, I'm Seán Murray, and this is The Conversation, where we take an alternative look at political events and current affairs through an Irish lens. In this show, we hope to pick, probe, investigate, and uncover the stories that you want to hear. We go where mainstream won't go. Today marks the 17th anniversary of the end of Operation Banner, the longest continuous employment in British military history. Almost 2 decades on, I speak to 2 men at the centre of Britain's Irish military campaign. But before we do, let's get a quick overview on this week's topic. And today's guests are Glenn Bradley and Seán Spike Murray. Glenn is a former British soldier who later became an officer in the Ulster Unionist Party, participating in the talks that led to the Good Friday Agreement in 1988. He continues to engage in various initiatives to advance peace, reconciliation and evolve political thinking on the island of Ireland. Seán Murray is a former IRA prisoner and leading Sinn Féin member from West Belfast, who was responsible for developing the education system among Republican prisoners after the end of the blanket protest and hunger strikes in 1981. He is now a full-time policy advisor for Sinn Féin. Glenn, Seán, welcome to the show. Thanks. Glenn, I'll start with yourself. Now, we can't go through your whole journey in Operation Banner. Can we get a short synopsis of what Operation Banner represented to you?
Operation Banner was the name, the operational name for the Army's deployment, the British Army's deployment to Northern Ireland that took place from 1969 to 2007. I served here during the period from 1984 through to 1992 on various tours. Most of my tours at that time were on the border because back then, as you'll be aware, the border was littered with permanent vehicle checkpoints and barricades and barriers to stop road crossings. In fact, there was 132 all along the 328 kilometre border between Northern Ireland and the jurisdiction with the Republic of Ireland. So a lot of my duties at that time would have been either manning or later when I was an NCO in command of those permanent vehicle checkpoints or on the border area. 3 of the tours that I did, for example, were as FRB, the Fermanagh Roman Battalion. So 3 of the 5 tours that I did here were completed in County Fermanagh. Back then, it was literally, obviously duties changed, but your day-to-day function was 8 hours of operational work on patrol or whatever that may be, 8 hours on QRF on standby to go to an incident, and 8 hours rest where you would get your kit, do your admin or whatever you needed to do. Now obviously if you were out in a CUD patrol for 3 or 4 days, that changed, but the general rule of thumb was that's how you got your day in daily. And our mission statement was quite simple. It was to support the RUC, and when we came into contact with the terrorists, it was to capture or kill the terrorists within the rule of law. And I did my duties as I was expected to at that time, and over 245,000 soldiers served here during the whole 38-year period, and most of them did their duties honourably and as best they could under the remit of what they were operating.
And Seán, Operation Banner meant something very different to yourself. Obviously we've all lived experiences. Can you tell me about your own?
Well, obviously Glenn and I have a different lived experience of what Operation Banner represents. So initially, once British soldiers were deployed on the streets, there was relief in nationalist areas, because this is in the midst of mortar attacks on the likes of Clonard or Down and other areas. It's known as the Belfast programmes. The whole streets were razed to the ground. A number of civilians were shot dead. But that honeymoon period didn't last long, because the British Army was seen to be acting on behalf of the Stormont regime. I think it lasted basically 10 months when you had the curfew on the Falls Road, where they sectioned off a whole area of the Falls and part of Clonard and carried out house-to-house searches. And from then on, they were seen as an occupation force. They took over schools, the doctor's surgeries, for example, that were vacated in the Clonard area, the old mills, Mulhouse Street, North Harbour Street behind us here. They carried out daily raids, stop and search operations, and illegal, what they called screening exercises. They could hold civilians for 4 hours in the barracks to screen them, which subsequently turned out to be illegal, etc. So they were seen as an occupation force. Their presence was resented, and obviously that led to a campaign by the IRA against the occupation forces in our areas.
Just for the audience's sake, we're now in the Clonard area here, which was at the centre of much of that conflict, if you like, in 1969, or the powder keg that blew in 1969. There are many stories about Frank Kitson, but you'd been telling me before about a story where Father Egan, I think it was, the British soldiers had, at the beginning, they had been using Clonard Monastery to look into the Clonard area and into the Shankill area. It was just a small anecdote about Father Egan and Frank Kitson.
Yes, well, initially they were on the tower of Clonard Monastery, which gave them a vantage point to oversee the whole Clonard area and into the lower end of the Shankill as well. But after internment, they came down from there. I think the Father Egan had put them off as a result of interring people from the Clonard area. So Father Egan was asked to attend a dinner in North Hard Street behind us here, which was the main army base for the area. And as he went down to North Hard Street, Kitson had this dinner laid out, and Egan knew the area well, knew what the people were suffering in the Clonard area, wasn't going to partake in any type of social event with somebody like Kitson. But anyhow, the conversation came around anyhow. He says, we'll get to the point. I want to have my troops put back on the tower.
That's the Clonard Monastery tower?
That's the Clonard Monastery tower, because that gave him that vantage point. And he says, you want to spy my community, my congregation? And he says it's an important vantage point for us and we want back up there. So there was a heated discussion took place in relation to that issue. And afterwards, Kitson thumped the table and says, remember this, I will squeeze your community like a tube of toothpaste till it vomits out the IRA. It was Father Egan himself who told me this story. This is a number of years later. And I think that represents their counter-insurgency strategy against our community. You know, our community was seen as a terrorist community, shielding the IRA, and they were sort of going to be squeezed. A focus was going to be put on them. They were going to be harassed until they lost support for the Irish Republican Army.
And Glenn, squeezed like a tube of toothpaste, was that your modus operandi, or what directions?
No, you got to remember again the era that I joined the Army and served, 84 onwards. So there is no doubt that when the British Army deployed here, huge tactical and operational mistakes were made. No doubt about it. You know, they landed here having been serving in places like Aden, Dhofar, Borneo, where they'd been fighting campaigns in the 60s. And they came here with pretty much the same attitudes. You know, throw on to that the English xenophobia, racism, if you want to describe it as that, against Irish people, you know, thick patties. And all of that was in the mix when soldiers arrived here in 1969. And there's no doubt they were poorly briefed about what was happening. You know, this, even as someone from the Unionist community, was meant to be an integral part of the United Kingdom. Here, Northern Ireland, England, Scotland and Wales, yet troops arrived here in the United Kingdom thinking and using tactics that they had been using in Aden, in Dhofar and other imperial outposts on behalf of empire. And it didn't work. I mean, it clearly didn't work. The fact that we had a procrastinated 38-year campaign going on, it proves to me that it didn't work. But, you know, when I joined the Army, I think a lot of those early errors were being recognised. You know, so for example, when I joined the Army, if we look, I'll take one incident, Bloody Sunday. You know, in my time with the Army, Bloody Sunday was taught to me as a way of how not to do business as a soldier. And that was instilled in us, you know, that at that time, now I get that it took, another 30 odd years or so for the government, the British government, to state that Bloody Sunday was wrong. But in 1984, I was being taught that by senior instructors, that it was how not to do business. So the army, like any army, is an evolving machine. It learns from its mistakes and from its errors. And I don't think anybody who views the army's initial deployment here will say, yeah, we got that 100% right. Another factor that is never ever taught to young soldiers then, and indeed even in my era, is, you know, Seán mentioned how the Catholic community was viewed as all IRA, and that's in general true. We were taught that this was the community that gives succor to the terrorists, and therefore that community deserves our attention more than others who don't. The reality is that we were taught 1969 is when it happened. We weren't taught, when soldiers were learning about the army in the contemporary world and doing Northern Ireland training, they weren't given the history to the conflict. They weren't given the context to the conflict. You know, coming from here, I knew that what was going on was part of a perennial war of suppression and resistance. I could get that. But, you know, your average English guy coming here, they weren't told that. They weren't told about England's involvement in Ireland and that this was a continuation of struggle. And I think there was this notion that somewhere in 1969, somebody flew over Belfast one day, dropping gas that suddenly made ordinary fathers, ordinary people wake up the next day and be violent, in inverted commas. There was absolutely no context to the conflict provided to any soldiers who were deploying here. And I mean, that's even during my time. There was no context to it given.
And talking about that, just about how it affected people, particularly in these areas who weren't politically involved beforehand. You were imprisoned a couple of times. Can you just give me just a brief overview on that?
I was interned without trial from March 1972 till August 1974, and then sentenced in the H blocks from 81 until April 87, January 81 till April 87.
And when you were saying internment, what age were you when you were interned?
I was 18.
For the audience's sake, just give me a brief description of what internment meant for people in these areas.
I'd say the average age for internees then was around 18, 19 years of age. In fact, there was a 15-year-old, Alec Murphy, who was interned, and a 16-year-old, Seamus Finucane, who was interned at the same time as me. So you had many young people who were locked up in a cage. So there was about 32 a cage. These are all nice and huts, like the World War II compounds, etc. Full of energy. You're locked up around 10 o'clock at night, got out early the next morning in relation to it. So the internees had their own command structure. They didn't take any orders from the screws or the prison officers. And we had our own system in terms of cleaning out, serving food out, etc. It was provided by the prison administration. We started some limited education classes, but it was known as the University of Loncash. There was also some military classes as well, in terms of weapon training, explosive training, etc. Might sound bizarre, in the you know, talking in the sort of conditions of today, but that's people seeing it as their duty to prepare themselves for a return to the conflict and the struggle outside, and using that time, if you couldn't escape, to put your time to best use to educate yourself and make yourself a more prepared Republican. And in the early days, the focus was on military operations, whereas in the H blocks, by the stages of the 1980s, we realised there's going to be a political dimension to the conflict. Hence the need to develop a politicisation education campaign within the camp, which prepared people for eventuality of a political discourse as well as a military campaign on top of that. And then in the early days, in the back of Bobby Sands' election, we had the electoral sort of strategy developed by Sinn Féin. So that was working in tandem with the military campaign. So Republicans knew that there was a dual strategy in place there in terms of fighting elections, while at the same time carrying out a military campaign in the run-up to the ceasefires. And it's the 30th anniversary. The end of this month, the first ceasefire. And obviously that broke down because there's no reciprocation by the British government in terms of having talks in relation to the politics of the situation and trying to deal with outstanding issues like governance, of this little statelet and other cases around police and criminal justice, etc.
Tell me more just about the education programme in the 1980s, because it was coming off the back of the hunger strikes. There was, I believe, a new strategy put in place in educating prisoners inside. Can you just tell me how that worked?
See, initially, Republicans didn't partake in the education system, the academic education system. They seen it as a systems education system. I made the argument, look, education is education. We can use this as part of our politicization programme. So we married the academic education. We tried to get as many courses as possible. We had to fight for the courses. I already had the advantage of having been at Queen's for a number of months before I was interned in 1972. So we married, as I said, the academic education process to our own politicization, where we studied different conflicts around the world. At that time, you had the conflict in Nicaragua, Zimbabwe, the colonial struggles, Mozambique, etc. And it was known as a FRELIMO program. Why the FRELIMO program? Because any time that the screws come in to do a raid, anything pertaining to current Irish history was taken out. So we had to use the context of a different struggle to say, well, there are university notes. So everything was written in that context, etc. And that's why it was called the FRELIMO documents. Because we knew at that stage the electoral project was well in place, and we recognised that dual strategy had to be accommodated, and that prisoners had to have the ability upon their return to the outside world of being able to put their hand to whatever was needed in terms of the nature of the conflict outside and the nature of the struggle.
And Glenn, tell me the first time that you two would have come into contact with each other.
Well, your father was always a person of interest. That's what the army called him.
Nice
he was a POI, person of interest, due to his activities for the IRA and for Sinn Féin. So our initial contact as a person of interest with your father was largely surveillance, because we believed that if we were surveilling your father and getting who he was going about with and so on and so forth, that we could build up a picture of an IRA unit that, for example, could have been committing an act of terror. So there was that soldierly aspect to it that we think. And
Human?
then, yeah, human. We wouldn't have, that would have been more an RUC term, but yeah, it's basically that. So for example, there is a time in the 80s, your house up in Dermot Hill would have been as part of an observation post that I participated in watching, just watching movements, and just the comings and goings, for a period of less than a week. And that would have been common back then as an operation to have been mounted against persons of interest to try gather intelligence on their movements and so on and so forth.
Tell me a bit more. I'm sure there's some anecdotes that you could give us about watching Dermot Hill. Did you, as well as watching it, did you ever enter the home, or was it the home ever raided?
No, I never. No, nothing like that took place. It was literally watching photography, taking photos, taking images, and just collation of information that was then taken back and transcribed it down onto other documents and other int that would have been coming from other to try give us a better picture of what was going on at that time within the Belfast Brigade of the IRA.
One thing that always stands out with me when the British Army had raided the house, and obviously for a number of reasons, he was never in the house, so we would have been put in, just as you see in Palestine now, where the children are all put into the one room, the living room. I remember at this stage that they had keen interest in the VHS tapes, which they were looking for, as they called it, propaganda videos.
Right.
So there would have been the likes of documentaries by Art McCaig. Mm-hmm. I always remember that we had one of Art McCaig's documentaries started around 40-45 minutes in. So the British soldiers would have put the VHS in, watched the first maybe 20 minutes to half an hour to see what was on these videotapes. It was usually cartoons, as they had thought there was nothing in it. But just as a child, feeling that knowledge over these British soldiers that they weren't going to find anything, because we knew that the documentary didn't start to 40 minutes in. We had spoke the other day, it's something you had said just based on the fact that we're going to do this interview today. A small anecdote about Dermot Hill, where we used to live, about the British soldiers raiding one day. And you were actually in the house?
We hadn't moved in that long. I was initially living in Avey, and they kept raiding it on a number of occasions. On one occasion, they wrecked the house. So it was on Hadwell, so we had to move house. We got the chance of that house in Dermot Hill. and that was a very quiet area at the time. And overnight they built this massive fort just in front of the house. So it came from, being a quiet area till being in the midst of a British Army encampment, and they used our alleyway as a back way into the New Barnsley estate. So after a couple of weeks, they raided the house. Your mother wasn't well, and I was in the house with her. So I went down, opened the door, says, "Oh, Spike, I didn't think you'd be here because we're told you don't stay in the house, right?" So they proceeded to come into the house and started raiding the house. I can't remember what resident it was. Was it Fort White Rock, we called it at the time?
Yeah.
Fort White Rock. And he says, "Well, we'll go through here to see if there's an arrest warrant out on you." Because at that time they had arrest warrants out, but it only lasted a couple of months or whatever. So he came back and says, "You're all right." He says, "We're not going to arrest you." He says, "We're just going to raid the house." So they brought out this big metal detector and started doing the stairs, and I went buzzing mad. And I was saying to myself, I broke into a cold sweat because I was only in the house a couple of weeks. I says, "There's something left in this house before I moved into it." So they pulled the stairs up. It was only gas pipes or something like that. So I says to your mother, "You stay down the stairs and I go up the stairs to keep an eye on them," because you're always worried if something been planted in the house. Especially the Scottish residents. The Black Watch were famous for planting munitions and stuff like that. So as I went up the stairs, there was 2 British soldiers lying in my bed, sleeping. So I says, "And what's a crack, lads?" And he says, "Look, mate," he says, "we were out all night, we're exhausted, you don't mind, do you?" Well, I was happy enough to let them lie there because they weren't ragging the house when they're lying on the bed. I subsequently went down the stairs to see how things were going with your mother. And she's making this female military police woman a cup of tea who was black. I said, "What's the crack you're making them tea? They're in our house, raiding the house." She says, and she was crying, she says, "This black military police woman is getting racist abuse from the rest of the troops and trying to calm her down because she's in a terrible state," right? And I says to myself, this is so surreal. Is this true? Is this really happening? 2 soldiers sleeping up the stairs in my bed, and the wife making one of the military personnel a cup of tea, given the circumstances, etc. After that, there was a RUC officer who was accompanying the raiding party, found a tricolour. And at that time, the Flags and Albums Act was still in place, and they get confiscated tricolour. So he's trying to confiscate the flag. So he's pulling one end, and I'm pulling the other end.
The Irish flag.
The Irish flag, and it nearly came to blows. And the guy in charge of the British Army raiding party moved the cap and says, "Catch yourself on, give him the flag." And the cap just pulled back, gave me the flag, and walked away. So it was, in a many ways, surreal. Coming in the raid, sleeping up the stairs, and then making one a cup of tea because she was she was a young black female getting racist abuse from the rest of the British Army raiding party. She was there because obviously there were females there, and they had to search the females.
So Clint, just moving on, Operation Banner. I mean, you suffered, you lost friends. How, looking back on it, how can you describe it?
It was a military response, a government response to the deteriorating situation here. Most soldiers did their duty with honour under very trying and difficult times, particularly in those late 60s, early 70s period. But I think, the conflict, we became embroiled in the violence of where the Ulsterisation process had pitted Irishmen against Irishmen. And I think the conflict went on longer than it actually needed to, because the whole point of us was to try and make it a political process. And that's where we got to in the Good Friday Agreement. Once the Good Friday Agreement was cemented, that leveled the playing field as far as the violence was concerned, because post the Good Friday Agreement, everybody, whether you were pro-union, whether you were pro-Irish unity, had to become a persuader. It was about winning hearts and minds, convincing the people here about where they wanted to be in their constitutional future. So from an operational point of view, it achieved its aims. Northern Ireland was maintained within the United Kingdom until the people here can decide their political futures. So from that point of view, it was a success. At the same time, it was a failure because we were operating as a Western European democracy and governed by those rules and regulations. The IRA could never be defeated. While the British Army was deployed here, operating within those constraints, the IRA could and would never have been defeated. Indeed, when it concluded, when Operation Banner concluded, you know, there has been senior army personnel throughout the government's own policy states that the IRA was not militarily defeated. But I don't think that was the aim of Operation Banner. For me, Operation Banner was about providing security that would one day enable a political process to develop. And that's the era that we're all in now. So from that point of view, I think it was a success.
And how would you define, just obviously through your different lived experiences, how would you define Operation Banner?
Well, I think first of all, you have to analyse the British government's rationale for putting British soldiers on the street in the first place. The myth was that they were there to protect the nationalist community. They were there because the state was in the process of collapsing. The RUC were exhausted after the Battle of the Bogside and the programme in Belfast and other areas, etc. So something had to be done to uphold the state in relation to it, because there were calls from the RUC to come in to the British Army because they couldn't deal with the situation any longer. And as early as 1977, there was a major or a colonel in the British Army called Glover who produced a document stating what Glenn has just stated: the IRA could not be defeated militarily. So why did it take them so many years to try and get a political resolution to the conflict here? They realised, they knew at that stage, and they used the term an acceptable level of violence. They thought they could contain the IRA, and they're happy enough to do that. Rather than deal with the causes of the conflict, they thought they could still have a military victory. And everyone realises, and as far back as 1977, that was not achievable. So you have to ask the question, why did it sustain Operation Banner for so many years? Was there a lack of political will to deal with the politics of the situation? Did they still think they could achieve, against all the advice they were getting from their top military personnel, they could achieve an outright victory? And that's a sad thing. So many lives were lost on all sides. You know, young soldiers, Republicans, nationalists, civilians, in relation to it. And I think that's maybe one that has to be looked at in depth in terms of the rationale for prolonging the conflict here.
So Glenn, Seán, I want to thank you for coming in. It's always great to see the work, the positive work that you do together, and you've been a great inspiration to many young people around this island. So thank you.
Thank you.
And that does it for another week. We'd love for you to join the conversation by sharing the link to today's programme to help us grow our audience across all our social media platforms. I'd like to thank our special guests, Glenn Bradley and Seán Murray. In the meantime, the conversation will be back next week with more investigations and analysis. I'm Seán Murray. Bye for now.